Hello everyone, and welcome to another video by Liminal Spaces. So I've been wanting to do another Bradbury video for a while. I've already done one. I covered the Velt a while back if you want to go check that out. But I wanted to cover one of my favorite stories, which comes from this book collection, Quicker Than the Eye. This came out in 1996, and there is a short story in it called The Other Highway, which is one of my favorite Ray Bradbury pieces. It's an absolutely stunning story, and I wanted to talk about it just a little bit. But as I read this and thought about Ray Bradbury in general, I decided that I wanted this video to focus a little bit more on Ray Bradbury as a writer. I'm sure a lot of us have read quite a few works by Ray Bradbury, but I find that as far as science fiction writers go, there's some interesting differences between Ray Bradbury and others. One of the main differences being, and one that connects the closest to our current kind of Booktube community, is the fact that I really don't hear Bradbury spoken of very much by big science fiction YouTubers, which I find very interesting because growing up, Bradbury was always my favorite science fiction writer. So when I started reading science fiction again, I expected that as I researched and delved into the community that I would see him at kind of the top of the list. And it's interesting to me that he really isn't even one of the big three. The big three is Heinlein, Asimov, and Clarke. And I feel like Ray Bradbury sold just as much, if not more, than those guys did. So it got me to thinking, like, why is Ray Bradbury left off that list? Why is it that when we do our top 10s, I don't see Ray Bradbury come up very much at all? And what I found was the question as to how science fiction is Ray Bradbury, which is a very interesting question and one that I'd like to look at a little bit today. I just wanted to look a little bit at Ray Bradbury, and not a biography of his life. He lived a kind of normal writer life. There's nothing really insane to point out that made... I mean, everything in his life, of course, made Bradbury who Bradbury is, but there's nothing really interesting to lay out that will respond directly to this question. Why is Ray Bradbury kind of ignored on science fiction booktubes? So first, just really quick, I have a couple of his books here that are his, I believe, most famous works. I know that a lot of his works are super famous. Picking his most famous works is kind of like trying to pick the most famous works of Stephen King. Whatever you leave off is going to leave a glaring hole. But I think from what I can see from sales and discussions of Ray Bradbury on the internet, these are his three biggest. The first being, of course, Fahrenheit 451, which started as a short story. This is very obviously science fiction. It's a dystopia where they burn books. And really started Bradbury's career. And like I said, this is obviously science fiction. The Martian Chronicles. This is my favorite cover for this. This is a book club edition of this second cover that they did for it. The first edition cover looks different. This is interesting because I was reading a quote by Bradbury where he says that this is fantasy, and he was really getting into semantics of how we describe science fiction. And he said that he doesn't think of himself as a science fiction writer. He thinks of himself as a fantasy writer, because in the Martian Chronicles specifically, none of that deals with what he called the reality of science at all. It's a fantasy using the guise of science to exist. there on Mars. Great, great book. I would absolutely say this is 100% sci-fi, even against what Bradbury thought. Yeah, to me, this is kind of one of the classics I think of when I think of a sci-fi period. And then we have The Illustrated Man. This is where I started with Ray Bradbury, and I was absolutely blown away. Like I said, I've already done a video on the Velt, but that is just the beginning of the incredible stories that you can find in this classic fix-up novel of short stories by Ray Bradbury. So his first three major releases are absolutely science fiction. And I think if those are the only three books he ever wrote, he would be discussed as a science fiction author in the exact same way that we discuss Isaac Asimov and all of them. One of the first things to state is that he would jump genres a lot. When you look at horror anthologies, you'll find that you can see Ray Bradbury in a lot of those a lot of the time. When he first started writing, he says that he wanted to be like Edgar Allan Poe, and that really does show through his works, especially if you look at his first book, which was called Dark Carnival, which has a ton of horror stories in it. The one I can think of right away is The Small Assassin. By the way, there is a folk singer that used the book Dark Carnival, maybe it was October Country, anyway, to make a folk record of Ray Bradbury stories, which I'm going to look at and be discussing on this channel soon. It's wild to listen to. But anyway, Dark Carnival, eventually he took, I think, more than half of the stories from Dark Carnival and put it into his collection October Country. So you can get most of those stories in October Country now. This was published by the Arkham House imprint, the Arkham House publishers, which did mainly horror. So they published Ray Bradbury as a horror / science fiction writer. So he jumps genres, and that may be one reason why we don't discuss him as much as a sci-fi writer as we do these other big three. He also wrote realism, literary, like literature, just straight what we would define as literature, which is incredibly difficult to define, and the definition is probably arbitrary anyway. But he wrote things like Dandelion Wine, which is him looking back at kind of his idealized view of his youth. And I think that he, more than anyone, and actually there's a quote from Life magazine that says exactly this, he more than anyone was able to bring sci-fi to literature, to become what people considered a literary writer, and also write science fiction. But I think he also just wrote straight literature, and that's what allowed him to bring science fiction to literature. So in a weird way, he, more than any of the other science fiction writers, was able to leave that science fiction tag behind. And it's interesting because when you read into people like Harlan Ellison and a lot of these other science fiction writers, they wanted to break out of that science fiction pigeonhole that they were all put in. Harlan Ellison says, don't call it science fiction, call it speculative fiction. And I came across the type of fiction that I love the most, which I called magical realism. That's what it was taught to me as in school. And I realized that you can put magical realism right in there with science fiction, and you could call it speculative fiction and all that. But a lot of these writers wanted to break out of the science fiction genre and have a more literary career. Philip K. Dick, his first 3 or 4 novels were all literature. He didn't want to be a science fiction writer at first. He just wanted to be a writer of literature. And he eventually went into science fiction to make money, and then brought his own unique literary abilities to science fiction. Science fiction did have the perception that it fought constantly of being, number one, a genre specifically for young boys, and number two, being a kind of a niche genre that only people who had certain interests would read. And all of us that love science fiction knows that's not the case, right? There's so much different science fiction out there, so many levels, so many philosophical questions that science fiction asks. I have found, going through my entire degree, I have read some really interesting, mind-expanding literature, but the most that I've found all in one spot is under science fiction. There are some incredible questions and some incredible philosophies brought up in this. And a lot of science fiction writers wanted to get out of that. And Ray Bradbury was the one that did so. My daughter had to read a Ray Bradbury story for her English class. It's the short story All in a Summer Day by Ray Bradbury that she had to read. And this is the story of the fact that the sun only comes out on Venus for like 7 minutes every 7 years. And there's this new kid in school, and she shows up, and there's this new kid on the planet, and she shows up in school, and she's very depressed because it rains constantly on Venus, and she's homesick, and she's sad, and it's the day that they're going to see the sun. And the kids don't really like her much because she's new and she lived on Earth for a while. So they lock her in the closet and forget about her while the sun is out. So this poor homesick girl that's only going to see the sun every 7 years is locked in a broom closet or a janitor closet while the sun comes out for 7 years, and the kids forget about her, and half of them feel absolutely terrible afterwards. And it was interesting because I sat and read it with my daughter, and after that story was done, I am not even kidding, my daughter had to just weep for like 15 minutes, just sob, because of how much this story affected her. And that is incredible. Talk about a measure of a writer. That is incredible. Now, here comes the really important part, and this is, I guess, the crux of my question here. Why is Ray Bradbury ignored on Science Fiction Booktube? Is the science in that story important? What's the story about? The story is about bullying. It's about bullying, but it's not just here's some bad bullies and here's a good kid. It is the complexity of youth and the mistakes that we make as children and the hurt that we cause growing up. And anybody can connect into that. And when you take away the science of that, when you take away the fact that they're on Venus and that the sun only comes out for 7 years, you can still have the story without that. Of course, it would have to be around a different concept that they were bullying the new kid, but you could still have the heart of the story completely. And that is, in my opinion, why Bradbury is ignored a little bit on these science fiction booktube channels, because I think that we're looking for mind-blowing science fiction, not that's not even true. I don't even want to say that. I was going to say not deep literature. That's not true at all. Philip K. Dick is one of the deepest writers I know, and in my opinion, one of the most literary. Stephen King constantly was angry and talked about the fact that colleges pushed him into the concept of genre fiction and wouldn't look at his work as academics. And I think they did him a disservice. I think that you can get a lot academically out of Stephen King, and I think that's true with a lot of these science fiction writers. Where's the difference? Let me read you a quote from Ray Bradbury that I think sums up the difference really beautifully. He considered science to be incidental to his writing. He claimed not to be interested in the development of science, but hoped to use it as a form of social commentary and as an allegorical technique. And I think this is the real crux of what makes Bradbury different from his fellow writers, is that he used science in an allegorical way to make statements about the world that he was a part of, that he was currently living in. He had the ability to understand character so well, and that shows so well in his stories. It's absolutely beautiful. And he also was a very nostalgic writer. I feel like most science fiction writers look forward into the future to try and guess the type of problems that people will have then, but also to use those as allegories of what's going on at the time, right? But Bradbury did make the science incidental in his stories, and he did have a tendency to look backwards, to nostalgia. And it's very strange to have a science fiction writer that looked backwards and was nostalgic for the past, because those things don't seem to be able to work in science fiction when you sit down and really think about it. Also, because he used science as allegory for things he saw that could harm the world or harm people living at his time, we see science often used as in a kind of a fable-esque way as a problem, right? To a lot of Ray Bradbury stories, technology is hurting us. It's harming us. It's taking away the essential humanness of us. And for Ray Bradbury, the essential humanness of us existed in the generation that he grew up in small towns in his childhood. Whether that's true or not doesn't matter. People have looked back with rose-tinted glasses on the good old days, generation after generation. We can't help it. We become nostalgic for our pasts. Whether those pasts were really good, of course, the answer is almost always not really. There was a lot of crap going on that luckily over time has gotten better, but we can't help but look at those times in our lives with love and desire of returning to those carefree days, right, of our childhood. And Ray Bradbury made a career out of that. And in a lot of ways, science became the bad guy to that. And I think that relationship of his with science is what, in the long run, makes it so that we don't talk about him as much on sci-fi YouTube channels, because in a way science was the bad guy for him, and we're not used to that as much in science fiction. When you look at people like Asimov and Clarke, science is usually playing the role of the good guy, of lifting people up, of making lives better. And that's not true all the way across the board. I know that. But yeah, it was a very unique aspect of Ray Bradbury that I don't see as much. Again, I haven't read all this science fiction. I hope to over the life of this channel. So I might change this opinion in time, but for now, that's kind of my thoughts on why Ray Bradbury is ignored on Booktube, on Sci-Fi Booktube, which really did kind of shock me. If you have opinions on Ray Bradbury, please express them in the comments. Let me know what you think of this idea. I love the conversations that we're having in these comments. And as always, if you like this video, please click like. If you like this kind of content, please subscribe. We'll be making a lot more of it in the future. I was originally going to talk about this short story in the back half of this video, but I think everything I just said deserves to be its own video. So I'm going to end here, and then I'll talk about this book in a separate video. All right. Thank you very much for watching to the end, and we'll see you next time.